I've come to realize that power in ancient Rome wasn't just something carved into marble in grand forums or shouted across victorious battlefields. It also lived in the quiet places, in rumors murmured behind closed doors, in the rattle of chains, in the shaking hands of people who'd lost everything. As Rome spread farther and farther across the world it knew, its hunger for control grew just as wide, reaching into every place it could touch. And in that reach it scooped up not only land but human lives. Among the most helpless were the young girls who were taken, sold, and swallowed up beneath the shining image of the empire. Their pain wasn't some forgotten footnote in Rome's long story. Honestly, it was part of the price Rome paid to call itself civilized. As the Republic, and later the Empire, pushed into new territories, the capture of entire communities wasn't an accident of war. It was the plan. Whether it was Gaul or Asia Minor, Britannia or Judea, the same grim pattern repeated itself over and over again. Roman legions would march into towns and villages, strip away anything of value, and gather up anyone who survived. And standing at the bottom of that brutal hierarchy were the young girls, usually no older than 10 to 15, whose lives could be shattered in just a few hours. The Romans even had a word for them: preda booty. The moment the soldiers laid hands on them, those girls became property under Roman law. The commanders didn't just allow this system, they leaned into it. After a town fell, officers divided the captives by age and sex. Girls on the younger end were considered the most valuable, the easiest to control, and they fetched high prices. They were stripped of their native clothing, inspected like livestock, and sometimes marked with brands showing who owned them or where they'd come from. Roman writers didn't shy away from describing these scenes. Plutarch, in his Life of Lucullus, even mentioned that so many people were captured in the Pontic campaigns that slave prices collapsed from oversupply. Tacitus wrote about something similar after Jerusalem fell in 70 CE. He described Jewish girls being dragged through the streets in chains for General Titus's triumph, only to be sold off afterward, condemned to lives they had no hope of escaping. The trauma for these children was instant and permanent. Many had already watched their families die or disappear into bondage themselves, and then they were forced to endure not just the loss of home, but the stripping away of their identity. In the Roman system, a slave wasn't considered a person. That meant these girls had no legal standing at all, no protection, no voice, and no future outside whatever their owner decided. Their names were changed into Latin or wiped away completely. Their language was pushed out of them, their customs forbidden. Some were marched for weeks across strange lands just to reach Italy. Others were kept in holding camps until they were auctioned. But in the end, every one of them was headed toward a market that viewed them simply as units of labor bodies expected to serve, entertain, or eventually bear children. And tragically, that was only the start of what lay ahead. I sometimes picture what those markets looked like. Not bustling with political debates or celebrations, but crowded with men eager to buy human beings. The laughter of merchants probably drowned out the misery of the people being sold. This was the slave market of Rome, the first stop in a lifetime of bondage for countless young girls. These places, called Venalitia, were scattered all over the empire, but the most notorious one sat right in Rome itself, close to the Forum Boarium. There, girls taken in conquests, or even those born into slavery, were lined up and sold just like farm animals. Buyers would show up early to look over the children, some of whom were barely into adolescence. Their price depended on age, health, and how obedient they seemed. Youth was especially valuable, since it promised beauty, strength, and years of use. When the girls reached the market, they were usually placed on a high wooden platform called a catasta, where everyone could see and examine them. Roman law even allowed sellers to strip them so buyers could assess their condition. Cicero himself once wrote about slaves being put on display like merchandise. For the girls, that meant enduring harsh, invasive scrutiny from strangers who poked and prodded them, checking their teeth, their skin, their posture, shouting questions they probably couldn't understand. Many had tags hanging around their necks, tituli, listing their birthplace, their age, and any defects, which might include not speaking Latin, refusing orders, or showing signs of illness. I always remind myself that those little placards hanging from the girls' necks rarely told the real story. Sellers had every reason in the world to hide signs of trauma or moments when a girl had fought back. And because so many of them were sold when they were still so young, most couldn't explain where they'd come from, or even remember enough of their own history to tell it. Rome's economy ran on slavery, but the trade in young girls had its own grim character. They weren't bought just to sweep floors or grind grain. In wealthier homes, they were expected to serve as maids, attendants, wet nurses, roles that often slipped into deeply personal forms of servitude. Whatever their duties became, they all shared one thing in common. From the moment of sale, they lost every scrap of control over their own lives. Once the paperwork was signed and the coins exchanged, a girl belonged entirely to her dominus, her master. Law backed it, tradition reinforced it, and force made sure there was no misunderstanding. Some girls were sold again and again over the course of their lives, passed around like replaceable tools. With each sale, a little more of who they once were disappeared. No ceremony marked the change. Just a curt order, the feel of a chain being pulled, and the blank, appraising look of a new owner sizing up their purchase. Those markets weren't only trading in bodies, they were swallowing entire lives, smothering voices, and propping up a system where even being a child didn't offer any protection. And behind the impressive marble columns and fancy courtyards of Rome's wealthiest homes, there was always another story playing out quietly. One filled with constant demands, endless chores, and a kind of suffering that no one bothered to write down. For countless young girls, life after the auction meant stepping into these luxurious households not as guests or helpers, but as objects. The Romans even had a term for them, ancilli, female household slaves. Their day-to-day existence revolved entirely around whatever the household needed at that moment. Every hour of the day was spoken for. They were told to sweep the atrium, keep the fires going, haul water, serve meals, brush their mistress's hair, watch over the children. Whatever the family decided needed doing. Rich Roman homes were practically small institutions, and the paterfamilias, the male head of the family, held absolute power. Even among the enslaved, there were layers of status, and young girls almost always landed at the very bottom. They were seen as too inexperienced to oversee anything but too useful to be wasted on simple labor, so they were usually kept close to the mistress, tending to her appearance, her clothes, or her children. But loyalty never guaranteed safety. A girl could serve faithfully and still face punishment over the smallest mistake. Warmth was rare and usually calculated. These girls weren't given private space to sleep. They curled up wherever there was room, in a corner of the kitchen, near the storerooms, or even at the foot of the mistress's bed. They ate after everyone else had finished, and only whatever scraps remained. Some were required to follow their owners everywhere, whether to the baths, to shrines, or to social events. Always quiet, always watching, always ready to serve. Education, when it happened at all, was strictly practical. A few learned skills like music, embroidery, or basic healing, but only if their owners thought these talents would pay off. Most were taught just enough Latin to comprehend commands. Their original languages, their customs, and even their own names were pushed aside. Forgetting who they had once been wasn't an accident. It was part of the system. Even the rare moments of kindness they received were usually calculated moves meant to build compliance, not compassion. A slightly softer voice or a tiny gift didn't change the basic truth. The girl remained property, stripped of legal rights and denied any true social identity. In that world, a girl's value existed only in what she could do for others. And the life she stepped into wasn't temporary. It stretched on without an end unless her master chose to sell her, punish her, or, on very rare occasions, grant her freedom. Unlike grown men who were often sent to the fields or put to work on construction crews, young girls carried a different kind of vulnerability. They were watched constantly, exposed to dangers that went far beyond household chores. Behind the elegant walls of Rome, these girls polished silver they would never own and raised children who weren't theirs, all while their own lives slowly faded into a kind of invisible labor that no one bothered to record. In those grand, glittering Roman homes, disobedience, especially from a young enslaved girl, had no room for sympathy. Cruelty wasn't the exception. It was written straight into the law. The Roman family household, the familia, worked like a tiny version of the empire itself. Rigid, demanding, and quick to crush anyone who stepped out of line. For girls whose smallest hesitation could be twisted into defiance, punishment was always nearby, used both to control and to remind them that they had no power. The paterfamilias, the absolute head of the home, held an ancient right called vitae nascisque potestas, the authority over life and death for everyone under his roof. This power went mostly unchallenged, and Roman law didn't offer enslaved people the slightest protection. Seneca once admitted in De Beneficiis that people treated their slaves as if they weren't even human, and he wasn't exaggerating. A young girl could be punished for almost anything: dropping a dish, reacting too slowly, speaking when she shouldn't, or simply hesitating at the wrong moment. Whipping was the usual response, so common that Roman writers mentioned it the same way someone might comment on the weather. Pliny the Younger even described estates where overseers stood stationed with whips ready, making sure no one forgot who was in charge. For girls, punishment often happened out of sight, in kitchens, storerooms, or quiet courtyards, where the humiliation piled on top of the pain. Public punishment had its own purpose: to scare the others. A girl might be chained somewhere visible or forced to work until she collapsed, all to make sure every enslaved person understood the cost of resistance. Some owners, convinced their slaves might flee, branded them with letters marking them as runaways. The Roman legal code, the Lex Iliacentia, even allowed the execution of slaves suspected of plotting against their masters. Girls were rarely killed outright, but the threat was always close enough to feel. Punishment wasn't just about discipline. It was a system crafted to break a person's spirit. Through fear, Rome kept its vast machine of servitude running, and for the girls who lived inside it, silence became the safest form of protest they had left. Still, there was one faint possibility that hovered on the edges of their world: manumission, the chance to be legally set free. For most young enslaved girls, freedom was little more than a distant idea, something they might hear about but never expect. But a few, just a handful, found their way to it. The word manumission comes from manus, hand, and mittera, to send forth. It was the formal act of releasing a slave from bondage. It could happen in several ways: a declaration before a magistrate, a statement in a will, or even a simple announcement in front of witnesses. But none of these paths were easy for girls with no money, no social standing, and no allies except the ones their owners allowed them to have. Freedom usually came only after years of service inside a household. If a girl became indispensable, if she served faithfully, raised children, performed essential duties, or, in some cases, bore children for the household, her owner might eventually choose to free her. Sometimes owners freed women who had given birth to their sons, wanting to secure inheritance lines or tie families together. When released, these women became liberty-freed women, but even then, freedom came with strings attached. Roman law required them to honor their former masters, now called patroni. They owed loyalty, work when asked, and sometimes even part of their wages. A freed woman couldn't fully walk away, not really. Her identity remained wrapped up in the family that had once owned her. She usually took the family's name, wiping out what little she still remembered of her past. Some managed to build modest lives. They married, started small businesses, or raised children who grew up free. Archaeologists have found tombstones that bear witness to these rare successes, telling the stories of former slaves who carved out a bit of dignity after so many hard years. But these women were the exceptions. Most never reached that point. Age, gender, and role shaped every possibility, and for young girls at the very bottom of Roman society, manumission was an unlikely dream, too fragile to hold. Rome didn't offer freedom as a right, it offered it as a prize for absolute obedience, quiet endurance, and sheer survival. Rome liked to call itself the beacon of civilization, but in its shadows, uncounted girls lost their names, their freedom, and their futures. The empire's strength wasn't just written in stone monuments. It was written into the lives and bodies of the people who had no voice. Their silence helped build Rome, and if we listen closely, the echoes of that silence are still with us. When we look at the treatment of young enslaved girls in ancient Rome, we're forced to confront what really held that empire together. What do you think their experiences reveal about the true foundation of Roman power? As the playwright Plautus once said with unsettling honesty, "Man is a wolf to man, not a man, when he doesn't understand the other."